So my name is Michael E. Murphy. This is the sixth installment of the Canadian IGF Speaker Series, or the IGF Talks Speaker Series. We hope to have it in person soon. But in the meantime, thanks for joining us. So just a few housekeeping items before we get into it. So this is all being recorded, and we're live broadcasting on YouTube. Pour les spectateurs qui veulent regarder en français, appuyez sur le monde et choisissez français. So also the chat window is open for comments, although it's not going to be monitored actively. So if you can, just please remain respectful in your interactions. We're talking about online harms today. Also ensure that you have everyone selected in your comment and not just panelists before sending a message. And obviously, we encourage you to take the discussion outside of this event onto social media. You can use the hashtag CIGF Talks. And you can visit CanadianIGF.ca to join the discussion list. So there's going to be a Q&A session. And if you can put your questions in the Q&A tab as opposed to the chat function. The Q&A tab is also at the bottom of the Zoom window. We won't, as I said, we won't be monitoring the chat function. So yeah, we're going to have questions at the end. Raise your hand, and we can throw to you to ask the question live, as it were. So my name is Michael E. Murphy. I'm an editor and the reporter at the Wire Report at thewirereport.ca. We're an Ottawa-based publication, daily publication, as part of the Hill Times publishing family. We cover the telecom sector, the broadcasting sector, and the sort of interaction between the regulatory sphere and the business sphere. And obviously that touches on a lot of internet and internet governance. So Emily, do you care to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Michael. Hi, I'm Emily Laidlaw. I'm a Canada Research Chair in Cybersecurity Law and Associate Professor at the University of Calgary. And my research work primarily focuses on corporate regulation and human rights. So most of my work focuses on platform regulation and online harms and how you balance that with freedom of expression and privacy.
Great. So yeah, today we're talking about how do we effectively do that in Canada. We have a piece of legislation, Bill C-26, currently working its way through Parliament, and I thought maybe we would just start, Emily, with, I mean, you were a member of the expert advisory panel that concluded its work in June, looking at how to put this legislation together. And I wonder if you could just give us an update on where the panel left off.
Yeah, that's right. So thanks. Our panel met throughout the spring, and our job was really just to talk through a lot of the thorny issues that, we're going to talk about today and see where we landed. Our mandate was not to achieve consensus. I would say, though, that despite that, we did quite quickly achieve consensus on some of the core building blocks, I'd say, of what a regulatory framework would look like. And so it might be useful to just very briefly explain that. We were quite convinced about the idea that there should be a duty on whoever's being regulated. So I'll just leave that broad right now, on some platforms, to a duty to act responsibly. And the work of the Commission on Democratic Expression came to that conclusion. And we were influenced by that. We were influenced by developments in the United Kingdom and in Europe. And it's the idea that really this is about product safety in a way that these companies have an obligation to manage their risks of harm. I think what was unique is that there was a strong push, I thought, by the panel that it's not just about protection from harm, but these companies really are at the intersection of our realization and enjoyment of human rights. So they should have obligations to account for the right to freedom of expression, the right to privacy, the right to equality, and be able to explain their decisions, right? How they are taking steps to meet those expectations. So I think that that was just the kind of the core aspect of that model. There were different, points where, we'll get into today where there was a lot of different views about, well, what should be the scope of this and who should this necessarily apply to and what sort of recourse should there be? I would say that the other major point we all really agreed about was there needs to be a regulator. It's not realistic to think of this as something that works its way through courts. It's just, and I often see this. I'll see commentary, they'll say, well, there we already have criminal code provisions against this, right? And so go to the police. Okay, that might be appropriate in some cases, but there's a bigger picture issue here, which is maybe, well, not maybe, I think that there needs to be some sort of regulator that has oversight to investigate maybe the systemic risks of harm and the fulfillment of human rights by these companies, right? Be able to lift the lid, be able to audit them, have the power to be able to impose fines on these companies for failure to meet their duty to act responsibly or be transparent about their practices, and you name it. I'm sure we'll get into more of the weeds of different ideas of some of this as we go along, so I'll leave it there.
No, that's very helpful. And there's, untold amounts of threads to pull there, as I'm sure you're well aware. But yeah, I mean, I can't help but be a sort of a journalist reporter when thinking about this stuff. And obviously, one of the biggest stories in online harm, in content moderation, in all of these topics recently has been, I'm talking about recently over the last couple of years, we've seen sort of a crisis of trust in institutions, whether they're government institutions, and this is transnational. It's in North America, it's in Europe. Government institutions, media institutions, and I think in the last couple of weeks, one of the ways that this has sort of manifested itself is with this sort of I would maybe call it something of a revanchist backlash that we're seeing on Twitter right now since Elon Musk's takeover, in terms of a pushback against at times against the very notion of content moderation. So obviously that creates an international context, a sort of a fevered media context in which all of this is operating. I'm curious how you think about that, as someone who sat on the panel, who sort of looked at this legislation from the inside out. How do you think about where this legislation fits at this particular moment?
And in terms of Twitter, right? Like using that almost as a case study, because it's so fascinating. And I think there's a lot we could talk about there. So my initial reaction, pardon me, I get excited and knock my microphone, is we need legislation in Canada. And this is why we need legislation in Canada, because you look at what happened with Twitter, and they've put, it was a flawed, I guess, governance, but a lot of work was being put into it. So from a market perspective, they, were putting in a lot of work to try to improve trust and safety, and sometimes failing. So there still needed to be oversight of that. But without any sort of legal oversight and legal mandate about needing to have certain structures in place, then that opens up the door to what we're seeing right now, which is Musk buys the company, and we're now just at the whims, we're at the mercy of whatever he decides to implement for Twitter. So Canada needs legislation in this space. But, some of the things that I think we're going to get into that Twitter really highlights would be, well, I mean, it's Canada. So, we're not a global market player with the strength of something like the EU. So, how impactful will our legislation be to rein in Twitter? And is it really going to make a difference here? Like all those different issues. But, I'd love to, I'm curious your perspective on some of this too, with kind of the approach and the thinking about content moderation by Elon Musk, kind of going in with the information wants to be free ethos that, we've been hearing since the internet's commercialization. And it was almost like, whoops, information wants to be free. Actually, no, this is really a complicated governance space and constant reactive decisions.
Yeah, I mean, it's been, as you say, a fascinating case study in how not to have a plan for how to do this kind of thing. And I mean, I sort of split it into two categories. The Musk Twitter thing, I sort of split into two categories in my head when thinking about it. One being the sort of, the dollars and cents aspect of how does he get revenue out of this company, which is leading to all kinds of sort of wildness as we see. And Eli Lilly's stock price, dropping a couple $1 million. As far would have to fact check that, but there's that sort of aspect of the chaos of it, and then I think there's like a sort of a broader, deeper cultural reaction that I see as while not necessarily having the same sort of fellow travelers, but being sort of under a larger umbrella of, as I mentioned, like lack of trust in these institutions. And there's like, sort of an internet joke about the mods, mods are asleep or whatever. And then I think that's sort of in a sort of backwards way is also about lack of trust in institutions. So it's interesting. I think there are some competing forces there, and I think there's a large cultural force pushing very much against, or pushing up into Musk's sort of seeming inability to run the company. Which is producing all kinds of chaos. But yeah, I think it becomes a very fraught moment in which we find ourselves and find the notion of seeking to combat online harms, because it's sort of it feels like in the last year or two it has really erupted. Things that we thought were settled are not settled anymore. When it comes to the internet, I don't know if you feel that way.
No, I feel like that. I mean, there were so many conversations that I think I felt like I and many others were sort of pushing for years, but felt like you were almost up against a wall. It was like, no, this is stable and this is how it is. And
Mm-hmm.
it's just like it suddenly has erupted. And in some ways, it's good because we needed to shake this structure of governance here. I mean, the reality is it wasn't working. But I also think it's been met by an extreme rise of toxicity, and some might say it was always there. It's just now kind of being mainstream. So I think that's a legitimate argument to be made. But there's a trust issue, right? And that's something that have mentioned a few times so far is because there's been this sort of loss of trust in the institutions and rulemaking. It makes it more difficult then to try to regulate these companies, right? So it ends up being reactive, and it ends up you're always pushing up against human rights and freedom of expression and privacy. And so anytime the government seems to step in, it raises all these other trust issues. But at the same time that there's just rot out there. I mean, we don't know what information sources to be trusting. And so we're kind of relying a bit on a bit of buy-in for governance here, but we're not going to get fully that buy-in because there's that lack of trust. And I think Twitter has been fascinating because what we're getting to see live is all the different mechanisms that we do rely on right now to regulate these spaces kind of at work, right?
Hmm.
And so one you were talking about was the market. I mean, as much as it was like, freedom of expression is now alive and well on Twitter, well, the reality is it's a business and it has to cater to the market. And it's not just like marketing, right? There's the big bucks for them, but also the users. Users have a lot of power. And if they don't want this, they're heading elsewhere. They're heading to Mastodon or you name it.
Hmm.
So the market's actually powerful regulators. So when you think of the role of government too, you say, okay, how much can we leave to the companies and to the market to actually address some of this, right? Like the answer isn't to overregulate this. It is to be very sensitive to these rights. And I think that the other is, he stumbled on the fact that there's actually pretty complex global regulatory regime. So saying, hey, freedom of expression, well, I mean, the funniest was the EU regulators' reaction to it, and the bird will obey by like European Union rules, and it will. I
Uh-huh.
mean, the Digital Services Act is fresh out of the oven and ready to be tested. So that's an interesting space. And I think one thing maybe we talk about in a bit, we were going to talk about the internet stack.
Hmm.
I'd recommend everyone should read. There was this really great op-ed. I don't know if you read it by Yul Roth about, why he was leaving. It was in the New York Times, and he's the, head of trust and safety, or he was, I think globally for Twitter. And he was talking about, one of the biggest things that we actually have to deal with as our regulator is the digital storefronts. It's like the app,
Hmm.
the Google like and the app stores and etc. And so maybe I'll park that for now, but it seems like this is a lesson for everyone in learning how this stuff actually works.
100%. Yeah, it has been a crash course in learning how it works. I mean, Twitter is obviously a platform, and one of the topics I think that is fascinating about this that you alluded to is the question of how far down the internet stack do you regulate? I mean, do you go down to the DNS level? Obviously, the CIRA, the Canadian Internet Registration Authority, has come out strongly against the notion of regulating at the level of the DNS. Uh, but do you regulate at platform level? Is that are you opening yourself up to a whole level of chaos as we've seen with Twitter? Where is the answer there? How do you find that balance? I mean, how are you thinking about that challenge?
Okay, so I'll tell you my thinking about this one. Although I don't have, you know, like very set answers here, because I'm curious what you think. Because
Mm.
so if you start from the idea that all companies, all organizations should be responsible actors, then it becomes really hard when you try to initially think of legislation for online harms to say, well, you should be responsible, but nah, you don't need to be responsible. We're not worried about you. There is a legitimate reason to say, look, this legislation just is narrowly targeted at certain players, right? That are sort of more of the high risk actors in this space. And I think that makes sense. Um, but as I thought about it more, and this was a conversation with the panel too, was, you know, just because you have to be a responsible corporate actor and everyone does, it doesn't mean that your obligations are the same. So I do like that the EU, and this is something that Sierra really emphasized in their report, is, the EU differentiates between the very large platform. I mean, I don't like the very large platforms thing in the EU versus other platforms, but intermediaries, like more of these infrastructure players,
Hmm.
like domain names. So the heavier duty transparency obligations and oversight and auditing would of course be on players like Twitter, like Clubhouse, like Rumble, whatever it is. Maybe it's justified not to have that oversight of DNS in that particular way, or maybe it's just that they're required to have certain policies or transparency reporting. But it's not that there would be obligations for content moderation. That absolutely should not be the case. My worry as you go further down the stack is that their options are, of course, less visible and more blunt. And the only reason that we're turning to them right now, some of the time, is because of the failure in just self-governance or in law and policy at the upper level of the stack by the players that actually have some control and can put in nuance, right? Like they could put warning labels, they can take the content down, they maybe could demote it. They have a million different options that are much more proportionate and more likely to be human rights compliant. But here's the thing, like, do you know what a good example here is Cloudflare and Kiwi Farms, right? So let's say you have legislation and it only regulates, we're still talking to, let's say, Twitter still, right? Or we'll talk about Kiwi Farms, like, so regulates Kiwi Farms. What happens? Well, right now, I mean, they don't care about Canadian law. They're sort of out of jurisdiction. They're protected under Section 230 in the US. And so where does everyone turn? They go further down the stack and the pressure's put on Cloudflare. I actually think that Cloudflare needs some sort of protection also under law, right? The idea that this pressure is very odd. It makes sense for users, but that's not what their role is supposed to be. I mean, it's primarily, cybersecurity, right? And so, but there's some justification to say, maybe you as Cloudflare should have policies and you should make them public and say what your processes are and have to be transparent about what those processes are. Doesn't mean they ever have to action content, but then that creates more set standards around it. So that's my thinking, is more scaling it that way. What are your thoughts about the stack?
Yeah, I mean, I will confess to a level of I'm not as up to speed on some of those issues as others, but I mean, I think like what we did see, or what I have been watching, this is sort of a different realm, but I think touches on some of the same issues, is some of the stuff around piracy. In recent years, I've been following and very interested in sort of what we have as an emerging regime around site blocking, but emerging through the courts, in this sort of ad hoc way where each new site blocking order, and there've been just a handful. Obviously, I have to tip my cap to whoever's skipping the World Cup to watch us talk right now. And if anyone wants to drop a score in the chat, they can do that. A number of broadcasters just received a site blocking order from the federal courts for the World Cup, for the duration of the World Cup. And the types of technologies they're employing is confidential. And this is sort of creating this new realm of online regulation, which is impinging on wholly innocent, independent ISPs, third-party ISPs who don't own broadcasting rights in this country. So obviously, a lot of the ISPs in this country are also large broadcasters, Bell, Rogers, Quebecor. But there are third parties that need to be incorporated into this. So there's sort of this, but this is happening in the absence of legislation. This is happening in the absence of a regulator. So I don't know. It becomes this kind of, and there's obviously a lot less. There's a lot less eyes on the court systems, and so. Yeah, I think there's.
No, I have so many things to say. Yeah, no, please.
The more eyes on regulation, I use the words, small r regulation, whether it's in the courts or in Parliament, the better. But just naturally, there's going to be less observers in the court system because it's complex and it's not as tightly watched as Parliament might be. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no. Actually, that's such a great example too of the biggest fear I have is, and making any mention of the internet stack is that, those bottom infrastructure players, they're not they're not hosts of content. They
Mhm.
should not be playing a role in content moderation. And so I think that no regulator should ever have the power to be able to order site blocking. And because generally speaking, it's an infringement of human rights. I mean, it's broadly scoped, usually is a disproportionate interference, right? It's maybe the whole website or whatever it is, and it's not even necessarily solving the problem you're seeking to solve. Can a
Mhm.
court do it? Yeah, they have the power to do it. As you say, though, there maybe is less insight there. I think that my fear more with the courts is that they don't necessarily have kind of the expertise that, I saw Matt Hatfield, posting a few things here, and I think that his comments about that proportionality aspect, I think, are key. And so the courts, I fear, don't actually have the expertise to know all the different conversations we've been having, broadly speaking, about the issues with website blocking. And yet they're tasked with addressing that, right? When I read, some of the judgments in the UK about this, rightly or wrongly, they're very cleanly aware and have a body of case law to consider these issues, which we
Yeah.
don't have in Canada. And
Yeah.
if they're not looking there and don't know where to look, then we have a really uninformed basis on which to make these decisions. But perhaps controversially, I would say sometimes it's appropriate for a court to order blocking of a website, even
Sure.
temporarily. Sometimes it's okay, right? And so it would have to be in extreme scenarios and just comply with principles of proportionality.
Sure. And I think, yeah, you mentioned the sort of the limited body of case law here. I think at the moment it's about 3 cases that have established site blocking in Canadian courts. But yeah, but for jurisprudence, they have to rely on mostly British jurisprudence. But yeah, so I guess the question of how do you establish this a regulatory framework around this is a good opportunity to ask about. Well, it's just to ask that question. I mean, the C26 envisions a regulator, and in my sort of day to day, I watch the CRTC fairly closely, and there's been a lot of heat and not a lot of light maybe around 2 other pieces of legislation, C11, which would be an update to the Broadcasting Act, and C18, which would seeks to establish a compensation regime for news outlets by platforms. Both of these are going towards the CRTC, the responsibilities for establishing these regimes. And there's been a lot of criticism of the idea of putting these topics on the CRTC's plate. I wonder. Obviously, the C26 envisions a different regulator, the establishment of a new regulator. What are the building blocks? Sort of, what's the recipe for a successful regulator? Is something I've been sort of fascinated by. Like some of those bills, C26 does put an emphasis on directions to the regulator, policy directions from cabinet.
You mean Bill C27, right?
Sorry,
No,
excuse me. Yeah,
C11?
Bill sorry.
C27. There's so many right now.
I know. Both C11 and C18 put emphasis on policy directions to the regulator, and there has been criticism of this as being too much of a gray area in which a regulator can operate functionally in the dark, and that is not. These policy directions aren't necessarily open to contest the way legislation is. how do you envision a regulator functioning when it comes to online harms?
So I feel like doing deep breathing here because there's so many intersecting things. And so the one thing I'll maybe start with is, what would I love to see in a regulator for online harms? But then what I would love to circle back to as well in a bit, try to remember to do this, is how does this intersect with all the other types of regulations that we're seeing being proposed here, strengthening our cybersecurity regulation and reforms for the AI Act and data protection and so on and all that. So I will start by saying that we need a regulator, and not to be too bureaucratic about it, but it needs to be a new one, because this is, in a sense, a digital human rights regulator. I mean, when you're talking about online harms, you are specifically looking at dealing with hate propaganda and terrorist propaganda and intimate images and other forms of horrific abuse and child protection, but also free expression, privacy, and so on. It absolutely should not be with the CRTC. Way back in the day, I was in the UK, and I've said this a few times because I kind of chuckle. My PhD, at the end of it, I was like, we need this regulator. This is what it'll look like, and it absolutely should not be Ofcom, which is like the British CRTC, because it's a broadcasting regulator. And it's not that it doesn't have experience with some of these issues, but it doesn't have experience broadly with internet governance, global digital human rights issues. We need a regulator that does have the power to be able to launch investigations and audit these companies. I think also in supporting these companies in developing their practices, right? Especially small and medium-sized companies, with what are best practices? What are codes of practice that we can develop to help the companies? So it's both helping them and holding them accountable, right? And needs the power to be able to impose fines, as we saw with our, privacy commissioner until now. It ends up being a form of guidance that companies, especially out of jurisdiction, can just be selective and say, well, thanks for the guidance, but I'm not going to comply. Like, we do need that enforcement power. I also think that a regulator is a key function of this regulator is really education and working with civil society and with industry and educating the public. So it has that. It's almost like a souped up version of the privacy commissioner, but addressing these specific types of issues. I mean, when I talk to different, when you talk to youth, when you talk to different parents out there, and different impacted groups, they often just don't know what the issues are. They don't know what their legal rights are, and they don't know how to navigate the system. And we have to worry and think carefully about burdening victims with this, right? And having to navigate scenarios when they've been so deeply harmed.
Yeah, I mean, the question of you mentioned administrative monetary penalties, which is a topic I'm always kind of interested in, is and how do you set those? I think one of the wrinkles of this is that when it comes to platforms, we're dealing with companies that have more money than God, that have and you mentioned small and medium nations, like some of these companies have larger sort of quarterly earnings statements than GDPs of certain small nations. So like, I wonder, I mean, there's a couple issues I feel like that come up there, is like, how high does the AMP have to be, or what way does it have to be administered so that it doesn't functionally become a tax that the company conceives of it as a tax we have to pay to operate as we do, to make our money the normal way in a given country. And I think, there's just a larger sort of enforcement problem around, and I think there's jurisprudence. I'm thinking back to the sort of conflict going on between the privacy commissioner and Facebook over the Clearview AI sort of scandal from a few years ago, where the privacy commissioner said, Facebook, you have violated Canadian privacy law, and Facebook said, well, it doesn't really apply to us. So yeah, I mean, there are these tools in the toolbox. Administrative monetary penalties. A level of international cooperation would go a long way there, I think. But do you see any other sort of tools that can be used by regulators in an online harms context to ensure compliance from large Californian headquartered companies?
I mean, I would say that the monetary penalties issue is exactly what you say, right? It is swallowed up as the cost of doing business. And, I think it's hilarious that every piece of legislation we see proposed, in all these Western countries lately, it's like it goes up by 1%, like it's
Mm-hmm.
4%. Now it's going to be 5%. I'm doing like 7% global turnover. And all of it is just putting a dent in what will bring companies to the table. So here's the key. I think that it's other things. It will be the beefing up the transparency obligations, which right now, I mean, any of the researchers who are working in this space, like so endless people trying to figure out, how do you actually make transparency more than a marketing exercise? How can you actually tell what their transparency being transparent about is actually useful?
Mm-hmm.
One of the most creative things that the EU has put in place is a right of access by researchers and potentially other civil society actors to actually get in there and be able to take a look at what the companies are doing, to be able to then circle back and advise on what they needed to be doing. And I think I mean, it doesn't answer the fine issue. It doesn't answer companies that are like, well, forget you. But it does start bringing in certain access rights to be able to audit what they're doing, which I think is key. And I remember in our panel discussions that was advocated for very strongly. I mean, everyone was of view that this was important. I think also that I think that more alignment amongst regulators, like this idea of online harms regulators, is really new. I mean, we turn to Australia and say, you've had this in place for what, 7, 8 years? So they were the leaders in this space, a very different type of model than what we're looking at here, I think, which is more risk management, and theirs is more of that
Mm-hmm.
notice and takedown, but they're doing a
Mm-hmm.
lot in risk management. But what I think we're going to start seeing is a growth of more collaboration and working together by different regulators together, right? And we've already seen a network forming between the Australian e-safety commissioner, I think the EU digital regulator, I think she's been talking to the UK. They're assuming
Mm-hmm.
that, I guess they're still hopeful the online safety bill will go through. I don't know. But so I think that it's not going to be perfect, but it's going to be collaboration. But I mean, the US still doesn't have that in place, but they have, their own regulators for at least. I mean, we should remember that some of this isn't specifically an online harms legislation issue, but is dealt with more specifically under privacy legislation, right?
Right, right, right.
Yeah.
No, 100%. Um, yeah, I probably confused a few people between with my C26, C27. That was my mistake. Because there are, as someone said in the chat, too many bills right now.
Too many bills.
I probably should have said this a couple minutes ago, but we are taking Q&A. If anyone has questions, we can please raise your hand or pop them into the Q&A box there, and we can call on you.
Can
If
I
not, yes, go ahead.
Oh, I was about to say, if we're still waiting for questions, it would be fun to talk for a second about kind of the intersection of all these crazy bills and different regulators that are out there, right? And I mean,
100%.
so even like the cybersecurity bill, I would highly recommend. I see Chris Parsons is here. Everyone should read his report with Citizen Lab on C26. I think to me it is just sort of the key piece in explaining the risks about that particular bill. But if we look at something like Twitter, right? It's to circle back. It highlights that all these issues end up coming into play, right? There's massive cybersecurity risks. So what what happens then when we see that those risks exist? What can kind of rein them in? Well, I mean, I suppose we have the power of the privacy commissioner to launch an investigation, but sometimes too, they're almost waiting for particular issues to happen. Like we know we know the data breach is going to happen if it hasn't. I saw some headline that there was an issue, but I couldn't verify whether it actually has happened yet, the data breach at Twitter. But there's other risks too about that information leakage and whether the space becomes co-opted and creates certain security threats, right? So then what we see, like you look at Bill C-26, and I started trying to figure out, it's so broadly phrased that, and it pushes these obligations on telecoms operators. And what if the minister suddenly uses power saying that Twitter is a security threat because it's so wholly failed on governance? Then what? Are we looking at someone there, then the minister, who has some power to make certain orders because there's risks to disruption and other threats that need to be addressed? Like, that's an odd power. And I think that
Mhm.
there's crossover now with this new AI Act, which has this. I mean, I will say I do not like the AI Act. I don't understand why it's set up as separate and you give this power to the minister and creates this one person, and how this, it really should be through the privacy commissioner. But, recommender systems and AI is deeply used through, to manage properly even, and to a fault. Uh, the social media spaces to address online harms. So who's going to have oversight of that now? We create some online harms regulator and they have oversight of some of that. But then maybe for some AI aspects, if they're considered high risk systems, they go over to this other minister. So these different regulators, I think that the different government, bodies like ISED and Heritage, they need to sit down together and figure
Yeah.
out. There needs to be a bigger conversation here. I'm glad we're seeing movement in legislation, but this is one ecosystem with a lot of spokes.
Yeah, 100%. And yeah, and I think you're seeing a lot of uh, it's almost mimicking. It's almost cliche at this point, but it sort of feels like it's maybe mimicking the "move fast, break things"
Mm.
slogan. It's just in terms of regulation, we're moving. There's a lot happening in a lot of different directions. Absolutely. We've got a question here in the Q&A from Alyssa. I believe targeted at Emily. You mentioned the very large platforms needing to abide by the DSA. So what kind of things are in the European Union's DSA that we might see imported to Canada?
I actually really like many elements of the DSA as a model for Canada. So let me start with what I really like about it is that they were really focusing on layering on top of the e-commerce directive, which is, I mean, some people know, some won't, is a notice and takedown regime, essentially, that there is a conditional safe harbor for hosts of content. And if they, act reasonably fast to take down illegal content, then they have a safe harbor from liability, and it's all illegal content. So the DSA layered on top of that is looking to get more targeted at the systemic risks. And I think that's key for what we need in Canada. I think the hard part that Heritage Canada needs to weigh through is that we don't actually have some of widely developed underlying liability regime in Canada to address some of that other content. Like, so are they,
Right.
so what are we building here, right? We have it in defamation law, but that's it. And copyright, obviously, but we're not looking at that particular issue here. I love the focus that it says companies need to be transparent. And when it comes to very large online platforms, they have very important obligations to be transparent and report and be accountable for things like the recommender system, the systemic risks they provide in the bill. It's now an act, access by researchers. There is a specific obligation to have incident response protocols, so crisis protocols. I think
Wow. Okay.
that's also really important. Do they deal with lawful but awful? They kind of do, right? I mean, the specific actioning of content is only related to illegal content, and that is correct, right? I don't think that the government constitutionally could create a regime where they order a private party to be able to take down legal, like lawful but awful content, because they're essentially ordering a private party to do something that the government itself could not do. But the obligation to have in place, these kind of risk management systems Absolutely. Here's where the EU DSA, I did not like it, is that why just target very large online platforms for that kind of transparency? I mean, if we look at the Convoy movement here in Canada, yes, they were making use of some mainstream platforms, but a lot of not mainstream platforms. A ton of content was being posted on BitChute and Odyssey and Rumble, and they were using Zello and, I mean, Telegram. So are we saying, I mean, we need to not target a law to a Twitter. I mean, think about it. Twitter's not going to be around probably soon.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah.
so but it's true that we cannot burden and destroy small and medium-sized companies. So yeah, maybe scale something. But everyone, all those players need some sort of system in place or support from a regulator in developing.
Yes, another sort of interesting question on the, in terms of Twitter maybe not being here for very much longer. Someone has asked, what do you think of the radical fact-checking experiment in Twitter added context? I don't know if you've been following Twitter's sort of the features that keep appearing, but I sort of think I can't help but I've spent the last couple of years as sort of a halfway business journalist, and it just seems like the product has been devalued to such an extent that it's sort of, all of these things I find kind of just throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks to see that the site keeps functioning. And none of it, I think, will ultimately be very successful. I don't know if I sort of haven't. I've been spending a lot less time on Twitter since Musk's takeover, which I think is something I've been hoping to do anyway. So maybe a success from that front. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that question.
Yeah, I do, and it's because I think the answer is unfortunately complicated, which is we need these companies to do this. So the best, most bespoke solutions will be platforms figuring out policy and technical responses, because, and we're talking about the upper layer, right? Like the Facebooks of the world, who say, okay, what exactly is here? What do we know about how humans behave? And what is something we can put it, because they have the power to do the most minimally invasive and least free expression restricting mechanisms, and some of the most thoughtful ones to kind of, it's like that nudge theory, right, of just sort of nudging particular behavior. So here's the risk, and it can be extraordinarily high risk, which is we're experimenting. So some of the what we understand about behavior and psychology, about how we're using these spaces, I mean, we're just in the early stages of understanding it. And so we often see social media change practices when they realize that research is evolving. So there's a lot of good faith work to try to think up a solution. But some of it just is a spectacular failure, right? Which is when we saw Facebook moving to the more personalized kind of meaningful interactions, and ended up then promoting these angry emotions and love emotions way more than just likes. And what ended up happening is it became a vector for mis and disinformation. So what could have prevented that from happening better? I mean, I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I think yeah, that's a very good question. What could maybe a less of a drive towards profit, maybe less of a profit motive. Yeah. But that's sort of, if we're talking about the upper level, that's the very upper level, I suppose. But yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think there is, and this is sort of beyond this is really sort of conceptual level stuff around the notions of online harms. But I think as there's a lot of people, a generation of people who have felt, who feel at this point maybe a little burned by social media, generally speaking. I've never seen so many people talk about just leaving social media altogether. No real interest in going over to Mastodon, no real interest in going over to Telegram for certain, perhaps obvious reasons. And it's I think younger people don't use Facebook anymore. I have younger brothers who don't even really use Instagram. They're they're on, a lot of them are on TikTok, obviously.
TikTok.
TikTok is the big thing. But I think there is a generation of people who have been left with a bad taste in their mouth around the entire experience of social media, and are maybe moving away from it. I don't know if you're seeing some of those trends yourself.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, especially even my age group, a lot of the heyday of posting on, I mean, things like Facebook was circa 2010, and that's really died away, and it's now all ads. Or you're seeing Instagram now try to get into being like a TikTok light or something like that. And and in some ways that's good. We should reclaim that. I mean, I do definitely have nostalgia to the kind of youth that I had that was free from this and just sort of was out in the world. But it has enabled connection and discourse in a way that can be incredible. And we can't forget that it's provided platform for major social movements. It's really given a voice for politicians and for journalists to reach different audiences, and for me to engage. So it has its role to play. But I think that they have operated with a closed lid, right? So we all feel like we're part of this giant experiment, and the subjects of it. And we have been, right? So what we need is not only actual oversight over what's happening, but then a say, right? So we have to be able to set what those terms are of being able to operate. And I think some of it is almost being able to justify their decision making, right? That they one of the creative things with the EU and dealing with some of the recommender systems and systemic risks is that it would look more closely at some of the harmful things that are impacting. If you think of youth and the impact on suicide material and eating disorder content, and a company being able to sit down and say, look, we know that this risk is here. We've got a lot of youth on our platform. We maybe owe them a special duty. We're sensitive to free expression here. We're trying to deal with it this particular way, right? Or we're dealing with, I saw there's discussion in the chat about bots and something like, how are you dealing with these synthetic accounts? How are you trying to figure out identifying them and protecting people from abuse there? But also the Rona said it's not like perfect, assessment of what it is. Just explain an account. But we haven't had access to that until now. We really haven't. And it's, this isn't for the courts. I mean, the issues we're talking about here are very different, aren't they?
Absolutely. Yeah. As happens a lot in these situations, the conversation, we've already accidentally run over time. But I think that's my fault. I was supposed to be keeping an eye on the clock. But I think it speaks to like just how much there is to go through here and how many different threads you can pull. So I would, and there's been a lot of activity in the chat that I haven't been able to dive into, unfortunately. But I would encourage people to, with necessary caveats, take it to keep the conversation going online with the hashtag. I believe hashtag. CIGF Talks is the hashtag. So if there's stuff we didn't get to that you're curious about, pose these questions online or write about them further, and we can keep it going that way. So Emily, any last words on this topic before we let people go?
No, what I might say is, there's lots more definitely to talk about. And I think that, some of the things that we didn't get to, everyone, should think about and give feedback to Heritage Canada. They need to hear from you, right? About, what victims want and the recourse body, and how do we protect human rights in this space? And what do you want a regulator to be able to do? And anyway, I'll stop there before I reopen the conversation about everything.
Yeah, fair enough. CIGF will return in 2023, and you can follow Canadian IGF on Twitter and Facebook for updates and registration for the various events. And thank you very much to Emily Laidlaw for being here, and thank you to Georgia Evans for organizing this.
Yeah, thanks so much, Michael. It was great